It's been a while since I've made a video of this sort, and it's occurred to me several times of late how much I enjoyed teaching that year's worth of YouTube Sunday school lessons a while back. I'd laid that project aside once I'd satisfied myself that I'd said what needed to be said along those lines, but owing to a recent and quite unexpected development and the dramatic shift in the way I'll be spending my days in the weeks and months to come, I think I may want to return to this kind of creative endeavor occasionally in order to break up the intensity of rehearsal preparation and leaven the loaf of my life. In other words, I'm going to need an occasional diversion, and since my thoughts do sometimes run along these lines anyway, I figure I might as well share them in this once familiar format. This is the first in a series of response videos to a single YouTube video brought to my attention by one of my favorite YouTubers, Viced Rhino. The video, 100 Questions for Atheists, was posted on YouTube a couple of years ago by a content creator identified as Erasmus. I haven't checked to see if anyone other than Viced Rhino has taken these questions on board, but it's not unusual for such videos to draw a number of responses from atheists whose viewpoints are all at least slightly different from those of all others. Although I've watched quite a few response videos of that sort over the years, I've never made one myself. Perhaps it's time. I do, after all, have a perspective that's at least a little different from every other perspective, since the circumstances and experiences that shaped my perspective were different from those of any other atheist. Beyond the need for some diversity in my routine, I must admit to another motive in answering these questions. In my experience, atheists and atheism are seriously misunderstood by religious fundamentalists as badly as they misunderstand evolution. I know this from first-hand experience that takes the form of exchanges with members of my own family whose understanding of my position is no clearer or more accurate now than it was 20 years ago when I first tried to explain it to them. And in the tenor of many of Erasmus's questions, I can detect the same kind of misunderstanding. That's what I want to address here. In the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that I haven't yet looked beyond the first 15 or so of the questions. There's certainly enough range in the first 10 of them for a pilot video of bearable length, and I imagine that most of the follow-ups in coming weeks will treat about the same number. In other words, this may well turn into a 10-week run. I can already see from the questions I've examined that not all of them are equally legitimate or well-framed. I will in every case attempt to respond with an answer that is direct, honest, and coherent within the limits of my understanding of the question. I will, of course, let Erasmus know that I've begun responding to him and will invite him to view my responses and comment on them. Whether or not he will accept my invitation, I cannot predict. He may consider me hardly worth bothering with, small potatoes that I am on YouTube. That said, he'd certainly be welcome to watch and to respond if he wishes, and to learn my answers to his questions. Erasmus's video consists entirely of the questions posed in writing, presented in 6-second bursts, underscored by an unfortunate choice of music. I will simply present the questions as they appear in his video, but with my commentary rather than the music he defiled. I can't think of anything else I need to say before diving in, so let's do that. Question 1 is both legitimate and well-framed. There's no unwarranted assumption here. An atheist is by definition someone who does not believe in God, and it is completely appropriate to ask such a person, why not? I believe there's a more or less standard response among atheists to this question. I've not been presented with evidence for such a being, and I do not believe in things for which no evidence is forthcoming. That's true in my case as well, but there's more to it than that. The thing that I do not believe in, a supernatural entity about which great, sweeping, improbable claims are made and in whose name certain powerful people make policy, is in my view not merely unsupported, it's a toxic and dangerous idea. We need to talk about belief. If you were to ask me if I believe in plate tectonics, I would think it a badly framed question and would respond by telling you that plate tectonics is an extremely well-supported theory that rests on a secure foundation of over 7 decades of research involving every tool in the geologist's arsenal, and its stellar performance as a theory, illustrated by its considerable predictive power, is such that it would be unthinkable and even idiotic not to believe it. To ask if I believe in it is to frame the question as though it were one of faith. But faith has no role whatsoever to play in whether or not I believe plate tectonics to be an accurate account of the way our planet behaves. So I wouldn't frame the question that way in the first place. My belief in plate tectonics isn't like Christians' belief in the saving power of Jesus' blood or anything like that. It's simply that a reasonable mind has been presented with evidence that is clearly unassailable, and my belief follows effortlessly and obligately. I don't have to work myself up into a state of belief regarding plate tectonics because I've looked at the evidence and found it overwhelming. Like evolution, it simply is, and the evidence is right there in front of my nose. It would be perverse to deny it. But if you were to ask me if I believe in justice and fairness, that's obviously a different kind of question, isn't it? It's not a question of whether or not I believe that justice and fairness exist. It's rather a question regarding whether or not I'm committed to those ideals. That's what the verb construction "to believe in" means in this case. I do, of course, have such commitments. They both define me and regulate my behavior. I have no choice but to act in accord with them. I imagine most Christians would agree with what I've just said. It's probably as good a description of their commitments as it is of mine. So far, I've described 2 different ways of understanding and experiencing belief. One is the kind of belief that follows naturally upon being presented with evidence, and the other is belief in, or better, commitment to, certain ideals. I regard both as equally valuable. Of course, our beliefs must follow evidence, because to acknowledge reality is to equip oneself to survive and even flourish within it. And to hold certain ideals that conduce to a peaceful and prosperous community is indispensable to a functioning human society. But there's a third type of belief that Christians experience and advocate, the type captured in the creeds, I believe in. It's the kind of belief that a Christian has in mind when they claim to believe in the saving power of Jesus' blood or in God. This is not belief that follows evidence or commitment to an ideal. This is the kind of belief known as faith. Unlike those other 2 modes of belief, faith is not reasonable. At best, it's belief in propositions for which there is no evidence, and at worst, it's belief in such propositions even when the evidence runs counter to them. Faith infects and corrupts those 2 ways of believing I described earlier. To return to the example I marshaled, faith will lead you either to postulate a prime mover for plate tectonics or to deny plate tectonics altogether in favor of a sad misunderstanding of what this planet is and a supernatural explanation for everything. The first of those warpages adds unnecessary complexity to one's explanation for how the world works, and the second places one completely outside the community of rational people amongst the flat earthers and those who believe the moon is a hologram. Faith infects the second type of belief in, commitment to, by skewing the believer's commitments. And just as my commitments shape my actions, so do those of Christians and other theists. I need to digress, but I guarantee it will be meaningful in this context. Whatever your commitments, when you cast a vote for a candidate or a ballot initiative, you are voting on behalf not only of yourself and your tribe, however you define your tribe. You are voting on behalf of everyone. By your vote, you're signaling that you wish everyone to be governed by this person or ruled by this law, whether or not they agree with that person or that law. For instance, if your commitment is to the highly dubious proposition that a fertilized ovum is a human with rights, and by your vote you impose that understanding along with all its ramifications on everyone, then you do not value democratic norms. Instead, you constitute a danger to them. When you vote to take away people's rights because of your unshared religious commitments, you're no longer operating as a good faith participant in a democratic republic defined by a constitution that makes certain guarantees. You instead reveal yourself to be the opposite. End digression. Christians generally claim to take their marching orders from God. They imagine those directives to be found in the Bible. The Bible is a topic to which I will eagerly return later in this video in response to one of the questions I'll be addressing, but for now, suffice it to say that it's not the kind of book that I think you should look to for advice as to how to live your life. Some of the worst rules for life I've ever read lie within the gilt-edged pages of the blessed old leather-bound Bible, and some of those biblical pronouncements go a long way toward explaining the bad behavior of certain high-profile Christians who cash in on people's vulnerability and massage the anger regions of their brains, people a lot of you would not want to be associated with. Without biblical warrant, those malefactors would have no cover for their crimes. With it, they can practically get away with murder. Do I need to name names? I trust it follows from what I've just said that my position regarding the existence of God isn't merely a matter of lack of belief owing to a paucity of evidence. There is an active dimension to that disbelief, driven by my recognition of the harm that the warriors of the Almighty have done to people over the millennia since monotheism first took root. The fact that 50% of the population of this country are about to lose their right to bodily autonomy on account of a bunch of theocrats brandishing their Bibles in the highest court of the land is enough to turn my disbelief from something passive to something rather more active. In other words, I'm not merely an atheist, I'm an anti-theist. I think the world would be better off without your church. Now, Erasmus, were we to enter into a dialogue, the appropriate follow-up question from me would be, why do you believe in God? You're welcome to respond or not as you wish, and in any case, thank you for beginning with a legitimate question that is well framed. I hope my response rose to that standard. There are, however, some things wrong with question number 2. It's a non-starter that cannot possibly advance your argument or even an interesting conversation. I believe I can illustrate this to Erasmus's satisfaction by asking him where his evidence is for the non-existence of Poseidon. I assume he does not believe in Poseidon, but if it turns out that he does, I can salvage my question by making it about some other supernatural being, such as Hanuman or Ahura Mazda. I'm going to go ahead and assume what is eminently likely, namely that Erasmus does not believe in Poseidon, and will ask him where his evidence is for the non-existence of Poseidon. Isn't the problem here obvious? It's much easier to provide evidence for a positive claim, such as the existence of Poseidon, assuming, of course, that such evidence exists, than for a negative one, such as that God's non-existence. In fact, the gulf between those two possibilities is so wide that it's generally acknowledged that the one who denies the claim shoulders no burden of proof. That burden rests entirely on the one who makes the claim. And the more extraordinary the claim, the more extraordinary your evidence is going to have to be to meet the challenge of supporting it. Can you imagine any claim more extraordinary than the one that a disembodied mind of infinite wisdom and virtue magicked the universe into existence with an incantation? So to answer your question directly, I have the same amount of evidence that the Abrahamic God does not exist as I have that Poseidon does not exist. Since I regard the existence of either as equally unlikely, I haven't exactly been motivated to try to gather evidence that they do not exist. What would such evidence look like anyway? But if one is going to make a positive claim about either of those gods, then one should be able to point to X and say, there's your evidence. And then, of course, watch in either rapt amazement or utter despair as X is fully explained by a scientist without recourse to supernatural agency. The third question is one that makes me wonder if Erasmus is actually serious about this. This is an awfully trollish question. The unwarranted assumption about people Erasmus has never met is enough to make me consider ditching the whole thing, but as I'm presenting this as a Sunday school lesson, and I think one should be able to learn at least a thing or two by attending any class, I'm going to say that the lesson is this: don't do this. It's insulting. It's like asking a Democrat why they support pedophilia. There are people who say things like that, because it's important to them to own the libs. Is that the kind of person you are, Erasmus? If it's not, then don't do this, because it sure makes you look like that kind of person. Beyond the unwarranted assumption lies another matter. It's simply absurd to imagine that anyone hates anything they don't even think exists. Erasmus, why do you hate Godzilla? I don't hate God for exactly the same reason that I don't hate Gozer the Gozerian, no relation to yours truly. They're both figments of human imagination. I do hate a lot of things that are done in God's name, however. I hate theocracy and dominionist impulses. I despise theocrats who shove their will down everyone else's throat, regardless of whether the imposed upon believe the same thing the theocrats believe. That's the theocratic United States Supreme Court. That's the Republican Party, which, as Mike Malloy points out incessantly, has become the white Christian fascist party. I hate the money-grubbing of prosperity preachers and faith healers and televangelists who claim to speak in the name of the creator of 1 trillion galaxies. I hate the lies of creationists and those of science deniers generally. Yeah, I really hate all that shit. Don't you, Erasmus? Question 4 is so ill-framed that I'm not even sure what's being asked. The question seems to place Jesus in the present tense, and if it's supposed to address the postulate that he's still alive and well and living in the sky, well, no, I don't believe anything like that is even remotely possible. If, however, the question has to do with the one-time existence of an historical character living in first-century Palestine, a homegrown prophet from the shithole of Nazareth who was crucified by the Romans for inciting a rebellion, well, that's a mighty interesting question. My personal position is that I'm not enough of a scholar to have a position regarding the question of Jesus' mythicism. I've listened to hours of interesting arguments by both Jesus mythicists and those who argue that the gospel accounts are based on an actual person who lived at the time, or perhaps represent an amalgamation of vignettes drawn from the lives of several such prophets living contemporaneously. Most days I'd probably tell you that I find the arguments of the Jesus mythicists somewhat more compelling than the counter-arguments, and also that I see no reason, really, to regard these two positions as entirely exclusive of each other. Let me explain the way I see this. The direct author of Christianity as an actual theological system was, in a very real sense, the man known as Saul of Tarsus, or St. Paul, whose letters, along with the Epistle of James, are the oldest documents of the New Testament, predating the earliest of the Gospels by a decade or more. Paul never met the Jesus he wrote about, although he claimed to be in receipt of a divine revelation of the risen Christ, and a story along those lines is told of him in the Acts of the Apostles. But Paul's Christ is a cosmic Christ, and the Jesus of the Gospels is almost completely absent from the Pauline epistles. Paul's Christology is a sort of Hellenized Judaism, a breathing of new life into some ancient ideas that had been circulated widely and for millennia over that area of the world that stretches all the way from Greece to India. And the Gospels then followed suit with stories of a miracle worker who reenacted the wonders wrought earlier by Dionysius, Prometheus, Hercules, and Krishna, dying and rising again like all those other agricultural gods whose coming back to life heralded the renewed greening of the earth in spring. That said, there is one gospel story that rings quite a bit truer than most, and you can read it in Mark 6. The complaint that Jesus could do no mighty works in Nazareth, and his lament that a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and his own house. Aaron Ra has pointed out that since Jesus grew up in Nazareth, the people there were on to him. They knew he was a faith-healing charlatan, and they'd had enough of his bullshit. In other words, it might very well be the case that the biblical Jesus is both a reification of ancient fertility lore and a shadowy faith healer who acted badly in the temple and got himself nailed up by the Romans. Question 5 takes the same form as question 2, and the same response will do for both, including my suggestion that Erasmus produced some compelling evidence that Jesus either once existed or lives in the sky to this very day, or both, whichever of those readings his fourth question actually means. Like question 3, and for exactly the same reason, question 6 is bogus. Erasmus, if you're serious about this, you really need to frame better questions, and you probably ought to try to avoid insulting your viewers by making wild, unwarranted claims about them. Or is that what you're trying to do? Now we get to the question I've really been looking forward to. Have I read the Bible? Man, have I ever read the Bible. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian cult. The Bible was considered to be not just the most important book in all the world, but the perfect word of the creator of a trillion galaxies, who also happens to be a righteous judge who wouldn't think twice about throwing my sinful ass into a lake of fire if I crossed him. So of course I read the Bible, read it and believed it as I was instructed to. I wanted to know exactly what God was thinking. In these latter days, I've read quite a lot of it for my YouTube channel, in fact, both as part of the Sunday School series I taught earlier and as book-by-book readings made years prior to that. Yes, Erasmus, I've read the Bible thoroughly, much of it many times, and I'm about as well acquainted with its contents as any atheist I know. In fact, one of the things that drove my journey to atheism was my reading of the Bible. That book will turn you into a non-believer in a hurry if you read it. I have to wonder if you've read it, Erasmus. All of it. Have you? Do you take all of it equally seriously, or do you cherry-pick the nice parts and leave the icky bits untouched? I'll bet you have all kinds of convoluted arguments to explain away the icky parts, don't you? Of course you do, and I know that because I had them too. I just finally admitted to myself that those arguments, those sophistries really, were fueled by nothing but desperation, that only a desperate person could be satisfied with them. I got tired of feeling desperate and walked away. As one of the world's most influential texts, the Bible certainly deserves to be read and known, both for the treasures in it as well as the horrors. I'm afraid the horrors outweigh the treasures to about the same extent that a T-Rex outweighs a hummingbird, but the treasures are, nevertheless, real enough. And one cannot understand much of American idiom without at least a passing acquaintance with some of the Bible's more quotable quotes. I certainly am not an advocate of burning it. I believe it belongs in libraries, in numerous translations, taking its rightful place alongside other influential ancient literature, but having priority over none of the others. The book of Ecclesiastes is a fine piece of work, provided one reads with enough discrimination to notice the pious emendations and dismiss them. This is apparently the only biblical book written by an unbeliever. The Song of Songs is sexy as hell, and the Lamentations could well take their place alongside Mahler's Kindertotenlieder and Schoenberg's Erwartung. For the rest of it, nothing believable or edifying in the least, as far as I can tell. The book of Job is an absolute monstrosity, a miscarriage of justice on a cosmic scale and a moral disaster, and it is in large company. Question 8 is easy. Do I believe that people have souls? No. I'll tell you a story, though, that might be worth mulling over. When I was about 8 years old, I was hauled to Sunday school shortly after my puppy was killed. I was heartbroken, miserable, sobbing, in desperate need of some consolation, any consolation, asking my Sunday school teacher for some hopeful assurance that death was not the end for my puppy any more than I was taught to believe it would be for me. But instead of finding some way to console his bereaved, grieving student, he informed me that my puppy would not be waiting for me in heaven because, unlike the humans made in God's image, my puppy had no soul. Do you, Erasmus, believe that my Sunday school teacher had a soul? We've already been over question 9, just in different words. This is not the kind of question that a serious person asks another serious person. Regarding question 10, I reject them all as nothing more than figments of human imagination. We'd be better off had they never been discovered. I have it on good authority that gods are discovered, not invented. I believe that's enough for 1 week. I'll return to this list next Sunday, and we'll be looking forward to that in the meantime, as the next couple of questions are among those I'm seriously going to enjoy addressing. Meanwhile, brothers and sisters, don't forget that just because there's no God, that doesn't mean that we can't live as though there were one, as though life in the universe had intrinsic meaning. We can be far more excellent to each other than any God ever has been.